please join me in welcoming to speak on Who's Afraid of Robots, Professor Victoria Baines.
Who invented the first robot? Well, that very much depends on whether you think they need to exist in real life or only in our imagination. We could resort to etymology, and we could answer the question by saying that the word robot first applied to machines by Czech writer Karel Čapek in his 1920 play Rossum's Universal Robots. But it clearly also depends on what we mean by the word. Are robots self-moving automata or self-sustaining machines? Or can they include other forms of artificial life? Do they need to bear a visual or other likeness to living creatures? When we take a closer look at history, we find that these preoccupations are not the sole preserve of the 20th and 21st centuries. Humans have been grappling with these questions for millennia, even if they haven't always used the same words. If we choose to conceive of robots as automata, we can certainly go back as far as the Hellenistic era. That's the 3rd century BCE for mechanical designs for self-moving machines. But tracing the idea of automata takes us back even further to some of our earliest extant literature, and it's far older than our adoption of the Czech word for slavery, robota. The Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, were likely composed in the 8th century BCE, and they contain striking descriptions of automata and other artificial beings. The word automatos appears 4 times in the Iliad. Once to describe King Menelaus of Sparta acting of his own accord, but subsequently to describe items produced by Hephaestus, the ancient Greek god of technology, Vulcan in the Roman tradition. And he's seen here handing Thetis special armour for her son Achilles. The automata invented by Hephaestus include self-moving golden tripods, self-activated bellows, and servants made of gold, but just like real live girls. Homer tells us that they had intelligence, noos, in their minds, phrenes, and they had the power of speech within them, physical strength, and they had learned from the immortal gods how to do their work. Now, we're not given any insights into the handmaiden's mechanics, but it's clear that they have been made, not born, wrought by the hands of a god who is also a blacksmith, and therefore they're fashioned by techne, engineering, as much as by divine magic. Hephaestus also manufactures automata for King Minos of Crete, he of the Minotaur and the Labyrinth. And these were arrows that never failed to hit their target, rather like modern guided missiles. A golden hunting dog called Lilaps, Hurricane, who always caught his quarry, and an animated guardian known as Talos. Does anybody else get a bit of a shudder at that familiar creak? I certainly do. Days watching the Harryhausen movies, and of course generations of moviegoers will know Talos as this chap, the bronze giant from Harryhausen's stop-motion production of Jason and the Argonauts. Now, the 6th century BCE poet Simonides describes Talos as Crete's watcher, made to serve as guardian of the island. And the most extensive description of him comes in the Argonautica written by Apollonius Rhodius in Alexandria in the 3rd century BC. Apollonius writes that Talos was of the stock of bronze, of the men sprung from ash trees, the last left among the sons of the gods. And Zeus gave him to Europa to be the warder of Crete, and to stride round the island thrice a day with his feet of bronze. Now in all the rest of his body and limbs was he fashioned of bronze and invulnerable. But beneath the sinew by his ankle was a blood-red vein, and this was covered with a thin skin. This fleshy vulnerability is what enables the Argonauts to defeat him. Well, that and a little bit of witchcraft. The poet tells us that as he was throwing heavy rocks to stop them from reaching the harbour, he grazed his ankle on a sharp crag, and the ichor, his life essence, gushed forth like melted lead. And not long thereafter did he stand towering on the jutting cliff, but even as some huge pine high up on the mountains, which woodmen have left half hewn through by their sharp axes when they returned from the forest. At first it shivers in the wind by night, then at last snaps at the stump and crashes down. So Talos for a while stood on his tireless feet, swaying to and fro, then at last, all strengthless, fell with a mighty thud. This is an extraordinarily graphic depiction of an oddly hybrid being. And in this version of the story, Talos is not an entirely wrought machine, but a hangover from an era of superhumans, a Bronze Age in which giants are born from trees. And in an earlier version of the myth, seen in vase paintings, Jason loosens a bolt on Talos's ankle to drain his life essence. And this is, of course, what we see in Harryhausen's movie. Ancient audiences for this kind of ending would certainly have been reminded of the downfall of another great superhuman warrior, Achilles, with his oh-so-vulnerable heel. By the 4th century BCE, the Cretan city of Phaistos had adopted Talos as their guardian icon, and they issued coinage showing both him and possibly the superhound Lailaps. Now, it may be stretching the comparison to view these beings as akin to the cybermen and the cyber dogs of modern science fiction, but it's clear that people in classical antiquity were capable of imagining metal humanoids and wondrously augmented animals. Apollonius's literary depiction of Talos also springs from a time and a place of incredible technological innovation. Hellenistic Alexandria was a hub for learning and invention, including in hydraulics and pneumatics. And these were put to work in the name of entertainment and spectacle, most famously in the grand procession held for Ptolemy II at some point during the 270s BCE. According to Calixenus of Rhodes, as well as there being thousands of soldiers, exotic animals, and floats of costume dancers, there were giant automated figures. On a cart pulled by 180 men stood a statue of the god Dionysus, 15 feet tall, pouring a libation from a gold goblet into a gold mixing bowl that could hold 150 gallons. And after this came a cart pulled by 60 men, on which was seated an image of the personification of Nysa, the city in which Dionysus was raised. This was 12 feet high. It could rise up automatically without anyone putting his hands on it, and after pouring a libation of milk from a gold saucer, it would sit down again. Amazingly, we can identify an engineer who may have worked on these automata. Ctesibius was a mechanical genius, and he was active in the city at the time. And although his own writings are lost to us, his work is commemorated by the Roman writers Vitruvius and Athenaeus, whose learned banquet attributes to him the invention of a pneumatic drinking horn, which had been incorporated into a statue of Ptolemy's wife. There's also Philon of Byzantium, who was active in Alexandria a little later, so around 200 BCE. His work built on that of Ctesibius, as did that of Hieron of Alexandria in the 1st century CE. Both Philon and Hieron were known as mechanicus, the mechanic, and Hieron published an entire book on automata making. Among their designs was an automatic serving girl, a real-life application of the idea of the handmaidens of Hephaestus. And this is a modern replica of that automaton at the Heracleidan Museum in Athens. Now, true to the ancient instructions, a counterweight slowly descends inside the statue to produce the forward movements. And when a guest places their cup on its left hand, this activates a latch, which allows air pressure to start wine and then water flowing from the jug in the right hand. Alexandrian expertise may also have made its way into other cultures, as observed by Stanford researcher Adrienne Mayer. The Lokapanati is a compilation of ancient stories from Burma, now Myanmar. And it relates how, after the death of the Buddha in the 5th century BCE, his relics were guarded by automata, whose mechanisms were based on technology stolen from Greek speakers in Rome. On this panel in the British Museum, the shorter figures standing at each side are believed to be depictions of these automata. Now, the date of the Lokapanati's composition is uncertain. It may have been sometime in the 11th or 12th centuries CE, so considerably later than the events related. But it translates much older Sanskrit stories, and the mention here of Greeks and of Romans is certainly intriguing. It suggests that the Greco-Roman world was recognized internationally as a center for automata making, which accords, doesn't it, with the historical accounts and the published technical manuals. But it also casts robotics as foreign knowledge, something that is somehow alien and therefore both marvelous and threatening. In the Lokapanati, theft of this knowledge results in death at the hands of killer robots. And elsewhere in the ancient world, we see evidence of the use of automata for vengeance and torture. And perhaps the most extreme historical example is an early Iron Maiden modelled on Apega, the wife of the Spartan tyrant Nabis. The historian Polybius recounts that it was an image of a woman richly dressed and a very good likeness of his wife. And whenever Nabis summoned any of the citizens before him with the intention of extracting money from them, he would say something along the lines of, "Very possibly I shall not be able to persuade you, but I think this Apega of mine may do so." And even as he spoke, in came this likeness. When the man offered her his hand, he made the woman rise from the chair and, taking her in his arms, drew her gradually to his bosom. Both her arms and hands, as well as her breasts, were covered with iron nails concealed under her dress, so that when Nabis rested his hands on her back, and then by means of certain springs drew his victim towards her, and increasing the pressure brought him in contact with her breasts, he made the man thus embraced say anything and everything. Indeed, by this means, he killed a considerable number of those who denied him money. Sadly, or perhaps fortunately, the Apega-bot does not survive, and we have no other means of establishing whether it really existed. This is, of course, a stunning AI-generated image, but this episode is presented as historical fact by a near contemporary. The author's father had served with the general who defeated Nabis in battle in 200 BCE. And the technology required to engineer a crushing and stabbing automaton is accepted as possible. Now, today's science fiction fans may, of course, be put in mind of a plethora of murderous fembots, among them my favourite, Pris, the athletic basic pleasure model replicant, played by Daryl Hannah in Blade Runner. The Apagabot is the ultimate perversion of the golden handmaidens of Hephaestus, but she is not the earliest evil maid woman. She sits in a tradition that goes back to Pandora, the first woman, according to Greek myth, who the poet Hesiod tells us was created as the cause of all man's woes and to punish the human race. Here too, the craftsmanship is that of the technology god Hephaestus, and I am by no means the first to notice a similarity between ancient images of her manufacture and modern depictions of robot creation in science fiction. For instance, the unveiling of the humanoid Maschinenmensch in Fritz Lang's Metropolis. We can also see the influence of the Alexandrian engineers on the automata of the Islamic Golden Age. The 9th century Banu Musa brothers and the 12th century polymath Ismail al-Jazari, in their works The Book of Ingenious Devices and The Book of Ingenious Mechanical Devices, share instructions for making numerous automata that appear to reproduce and build on the designs of Philon and Hierome, including these humanoid servants. They are, nonetheless, extraordinary bodies of work in their own right. And transfer of this foreign knowledge may have been quite fluid. When the Franciscan friar William of Rubruck visited the Mongol Empire in the 13th century, he was shown a wondrous silver tree in the Great Khan's court at Karakoram, which had animated lions and snakes that belched forth different types of beverage. And he claims that it had been built by one William Bouchier, a Parisian metalsmith who had been captured by the Mongols when he was living in the Balkans. Over time, automation becomes a regular marvel in travel narratives, among them the rather unreliable 14th century travels of Sir John Mandeville, as well as describing men with dogs' heads, men with no heads, and meat growing on trees. The author describes a false paradise garden of automata designed to trick men into drinking a potion that turns them into zombie henchmen. Artificial life thus comes to be identified not only as foreign knowledge, but also as trickery. Its very lifelikeness a warning that it is not to be trusted. So automata such as animated statues have served as objects of wonder, what the Greeks called thaumaata, for thousands of years, just as Jacques de Vaucanson's flute player, tambourine player, and digesting duck did in 18th century France. And they have served also as vehicles for deception. As the name suggests, the digesting duck appeared to eat, digest, and excrete food. Vaucanson claimed that chemistry broke down the food in the duck's stomach, but this was later revealed to be untrue. The duck did not process the food at all, but expelled breadcrumb pellets that had been dyed green. And such has been our desire for thinking machines that we've also constructed devices under the pretense that they are sentient. When the automaton chess player, also known as the Mechanical Turk, was unveiled by Wolfgang von Kempelen in 1770, it was presented as autonomous. It toured the world with Kempelen and its subsequent owner, Johann Melzel. And it baffled and delighted audiences in equal measure, defeating both Benjamin Franklin and Napoleon Bonaparte. Edgar Allan Poe observed in an 1836 essay that we find everywhere men of mechanical genius, of great general acuteness and discriminative understanding, who make no scruple in pronouncing the automaton a pure machine, unconnected with human agency in its movements, and consequently, beyond all comparison, the most astonishing of the inventions of mankind. Poe, however, was not convinced, stating that it is quite certain that the operations of the automaton are regulated by mind and by nothing else. The only question, then, is of the manner in which human agency is brought to bear. He was not alone in asserting that the Turk was an elaborate hoax. But the precise nature of the machine's operations was not fully revealed until 1857, when S.W. Mitchell, the son of its final owner, published a mock obituary following its destruction in a fire. A series of human operators, all highly skilled chess players, had been concealed in the cabinet beneath the Turk. The machinery required to move the mannequin and to maintain the illusion was no mean feat of engineering. Operators had to be rolled out of sight when the owner opened the doors so that the audience could see through the cabinet. But arguably, the greatest achievement of all was the ability of respective owners and operators to keep this knowledge secret for several decades. And Mitchell boasted, perhaps no secret was ever kept as the Turk's has been, guessed at in part many times. None of the several explanations in our possession has ever practically solved this amusing puzzle. For several years, the Turk was owned by a company of Philadelphia gentlemen. All of them were aware of the secret. It was, however, a self-guarded trust, since few who had seen the interior arrangements of the automaton would have been able to expound his puzzling anatomy. Half in jest, then, and partly from the above-named consideration, the secret has been kept. People wanted to believe what they saw, and its owners had a vested interest in ensuring that they did. Not only was their machine a profit-making venture, but they were also, says Mitchell, laughing at our expense. In the end, the Turk was the engineering equivalent of a conjurer's smoke and mirrors, and one wonders whether the secret of its operations would have been so well kept in our current era of social media, citizen news reporting, and viral information. At the same time, there's a parallel between the Turk's enchantment of its audience and more recent hype over AI. Both technologies offer an appearance of sentience, such that even the most expert professionals may find themselves willing to suspend their disbelief. For instance, in 2022, a Google engineer was dismissed from the company after publicly claiming that its Lambda chatbot had a soul because it appeared worried about being misrepresented. Hype generates expectations which are very rarely balanced. Technology provokes fear as often as it sparks wide-eyed enthusiasm, but less so an unemotional reaction. At one extreme, the tech bro in crowd can evangelize to the point of overpromising. At the other, emerging technologies, AI among them, are liable to diagnosis as the downfall of humanity. Ambivalence is very rarely expressed. Here are just a few news headlines that I pulled from a search engine last Friday, and the overall impression is rather disconcerting, but also paradoxical. That artificial intelligence will both save and destroy us. Exclusionary in-jokes don't help to endear big tech to quote-unquote ordinary people. When Amazon established a global marketplace for microtasking, which is the coordinated outsourcing of jobs to a distributed workforce, they chose the name Mechanical Turk. Now, unless one knows the story behind the operations of the Turk, The name may give the service an air of mystery, when in fact it is a very specific reference to the humans that make the illusion of automation possible and are thus themselves in the service of technology. In the context of both ongoing exploitation of lowly paid tech workforces around the world and our own exploration of the workers of the past in my lecture on the ancient history of computers and code, we would, I think, be justified in finding such a light-hearted, dare I say, frivolous reference in poor taste. But that is not to say that there is no room for laughter in robot-human relations. If you watched my lecture on the massive Internet of Things, you will know that I have a reasonably close relationship with my robot vacuum cleaner. And this has resulted in it surprising me a number of times with seemingly spontaneous activity. I, in turn, thank it for its service and I assist it over obstacles in my home. For a while, in the absence of a pet or other constant companion, I found myself slipping into direct dialogue with a machine, much as many of us do with smart speakers and virtual assistants. While this may make us feel temporarily foolish, I would argue that a natural inclination towards kind and humane interactions is cause for hope. Ever since Talos and Apega, humanoids have served as mirrors for our behaviour towards each other, our foibles and our preoccupations. This tradition persists in countless depictions in science fiction. Blade Runner's replicants, the cute slapstick of Star Wars C-3PO and R2-D2, and inheritance of some of our more gloomy and tedious traits by Marvin the paranoid android in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It lives on also in the surviving art of automata making, especially that of engineer and cartoonist Tim Hunkin, whose machines can be found on Southwold Pier in Suffolk and in the Novelty Automation Arcade just a stone's throw, a couple of streets away actually, here in central London. Among machines that simulate the experience of being frisked by security staff, a highly condensed holiday, the joys of divorce, being probed by aliens, and most terrifying of all, the awkwardness of making eye contact when travelling on the London Underground, are coin-operated humanoids that put a satirical spin on the laughing policemen and fortune-tellers of yesteryear. So, on the left here we see an art expert, modelled on former Tate Gallery director Nicholas Sirota, who passes judgment on whether an object is or is not art, snobbishly and rather uncouthly sticking out his tongue in the process. A chiropodist subjects the paying victim's stockinged foot to examination and manipulation, and a doctor diagnoses ailments with a stethoscope, writing out prescriptions that are, in its inventor's words, totally illegible, like all real prescriptions. Machines like these may prompt us to reconsider the automatic, mechanical quality of many of our human interactions, to question the extent to which they are meaningful, and to ponder our willingness to subject ourselves to them. And one of the most striking things about Hunkin's automata is the nervous glee with which visitors place themselves at their mercy. I squealed when the giant rubber gloves of the auto-frisk machine subjected me to a manual security search, which was only slightly less intrusive than the alien probe. And I admit to having been slightly worried when the chiropodist disappeared from view to inspect my bunions. Context may be important here. Humans seem willing to interact with machines like this when they perceive themselves to be in a safe, controlled space. There's something of a parallel here with the use of digital technology in our homes, where the perception of safety can lead us to be somewhat foolhardy with our security and our privacy. And there's another lesson for our development and our interactions with AI. With sufficient safeguards, currently known as guardrails, it suggests that perhaps we could be persuaded to trust it. Historical and contemporary examples illustrate how artificial life has been conceived of as both serving and threatening man. Concerns about AI taking over echo centuries-old fears that increasing mechanization and automation jeopardize lives and livelihoods, but also that traditional master-slave relationships will be subverted. Aristotle speculated precisely on this possibility in his 4th century BCE treatise on politics, saying, "Every assistant is, as it were, a tool that serves for several tools. For if every tool could perform its own work when ordered, or by seeing what to do in advance, like the statues of Daedalus in the story or the tripods of Hephaestus, which the poet says entered the assembly of the gods of their own accord, automatoi. If thus shuttles wove and quills played harps of themselves, master craftsmen would have no need of assistants, and masters no need of slaves." Anthropomorphic machines are therefore the ultimate underclass, because they're property that we don't even need to dehumanize in order to comfortably exploit them. Curiously, we tend not to dismiss them as savages in the way that humans have explained away their mistreatment of colonized or enslaved peoples. The robots of our imagination and of our reality are often characterized as extremely sophisticated, but we can at least reassure ourselves that they do not have feelings to hurt or rights. There's an inevitable tension here with the role of robots as our companions. In fiction, maid sidekicks such as the Tin Man in The Wizard of Oz and Marvin in The Hitchhiker's Guide are enlivened, but still very much subordinate to their human counterparts. In the latter, the Sirius Cybernetics Corporation's definition of a robot as your plastic pal who's fun to be with is undermined not only by Marvin's depressive personality, but by the guide's own definition of the corporation's marketing division as a bunch of mindless jerks who'll be the first against the wall when the revolution comes. In the real world, robot pets may attract our affection and engagement, but can ultimately be switched off. This is not to deny the ability of humans to develop emotional attachments to machines, sometimes known as the Tamagotchi effect, after the virtual pets first popularized in the 1990s. As we saw in my lecture on sex and the internet last year, recent developments in both robotics and AI are powering a burgeoning market for advanced sex robots that can be customized according to the client's preferences for physical appearance, anatomy, and personality. Like Pygmalion in the myth as told by the Roman poet Ovid, men, for the most part, carve out an image of their ideal woman, which is then brought to life. So Ovid writes in the Metamorphoses that Pygmalion saw women waste their lives in wretched shame, and critical of faults which nature had so deeply planted through their female hearts, he lived in preference for many years unmarried. But while he was single, with consummate skill, he carved a statue out of snow-white ivory and gave to it exquisite beauty, which no woman of the world has ever equalled. She was so beautiful he fell in love with his creation. It appeared, in truth, a perfect virgin, with the grace of life, but in the expression of such modesty, all motion was restrained, and so his art concealed his art. Pygmalion gazed, inflamed with love and admiration, for the form he had carved in semblance of a woman. When the statue comes to life, she's the perfect woman because she is unlike real women. And ideal women in virtual worlds and sex and companion robots are often similarly fashioned, with extreme made-to-order features that are reminiscent of those prized in mainstream pornographic performance. AI-enabled apps marketed as virtual boyfriends and virtual girlfriends are similarly customizable. Some of you may remember my boyfriend Barnard from Sex and the Internet, and the fact that the relationship was doomed pretty much as soon as Barnard started to get all passive-aggressive on me. But the fact that he exists only in data does not, of itself, preclude emotional engagement. And in a different context, use of AI to create an interactive chatbot, replica of a deceased loved one, is central to so-called grief tech apps. The jury is very much still out on whether these help or hinder the grieving process. Experts are equally divided on whether machines can ever become sentient. If they do, and that's a very big if, will we need to treat them better than we do now? In 2021, Kazuo Ishiguro published Clara and the Sun, a novel which imagines a speculative future from the point of view of an intelligent, artificial friend to a sick, academically gifted child. Now, I'm not going to spoil the plot for those of you who haven't read it, but essentially Clara's experience as a companion and potential human substitute prompts discomforting reflection as much about how we treat each other as about how we interact with technology. And in this respect, Clara and other modern representations of humanoids and automata are the inheritors of Talos, the golden handmaidens of Hephaestus, and Pygmalion's perfect girl. Robots like this one, Erica, developed by Kyoto and Osaka universities, may elicit empathy, but also discomfort. In a now seminal essay, in 1970, Masahiro Mori proposed the uncanny valley, the region of negative emotional response towards robots that seem almost human, but not quite enough. Now, there's a lot to unpack here, but hopefully you can see two curves. A solid one that plots feelings of affinity against human likeness for still objects, and a dashed one that does the same for moving objects. It's worth emphasizing that this is just a hypothesis. But what I take from it is the suggestion that we are more comfortable with machines that we can clearly identify as machines than with those that resemble humans to such a degree that we risk being fooled or worse. The automata and the humanoids encountered in the ancient world and its imagination can be situated for the most part on these leading upward curves. The trough we really want to avoid is the one in which we feel we are interacting with a corpse, especially a reanimated one. Now, I should qualify that personally, I'm not entirely comfortable with putting prosthetic hands in this zone. It is, I think, quite possible to argue that society has become more used to and therefore much more comfortable with seeing these since Mori published his essay over 50 years ago. But the general point about the rationale behind robotic revulsion is easier to accept. It's the stuff of horror, which takes us into the supremely unnatural realm of Frankenstein, the ultimate expression of technology as monstrous. Curiously, it also takes us back once again to those ancient epic heroes, this time as depicted in the medieval literary tradition. This image comes from an edition of Guido del Colonne's Latin prose history of the destruction of Troy, published in the 13th century. It shows the corpse of Hector, preserved in a lifelike state by an urn that continuously pours balm over his head. Now, this text is the source material for an epic poem written in Middle English in the early 15th century by a monk named John Lydgate. Lydgate's description of the technique of preservation is technically far more detailed than in the earlier work. King Priam sends for the most skilled master craftsmen to preserve Hector from, quote, odour and abomination. And this is achieved as follows, as translated into modern English by David Faverger. For on his head, just as we have been told, through small pipes, wrought from and made out of gold, that were bent down by careful measurement to an entry they had made in his crown, with expert advice and great subtlety to each side and extremity of his body, drawn down in a straight line through nerves and sinews, driven and directed by hidden tubes, skilfully extended, whereby the liquid might descend downwards to keep him wholly from all corruption, without change or any transformation of his skin or colour in any part. And at his head, of gold, there was an urn that was filled up with a natural balm, which ran downwards through artificial pipes, through neck and head into many places, penetrated by veins within his face, that through the magic liquid's force and strength, he was conserved, lifelike in his colour, fresh of hue, living and not at all pale, so mighty was the effect of the balm. As Ellie Truitt has observed in her excellent book on medieval robots, which I highly recommend, natural body parts here are replaced by mechanical processes that move vital fluids through the body. And in this respect, Lydgate's Hector presents rather as the opposite of our ancient giant Talos. Where Talos is a metal man with veins that resemble those of humans, the preserved Hector is externally made of flesh, but internally mechanical. Although to all intents and purposes inanimate, he prefigures both the science of bionics and our fascination with cyborgs. Equally, simply saying that robots that look less lifelike make us feel more comfortable doesn't seem to be quite enough. This is Boston Dynamics' mobile robot, which, according to their marketing material, promises to automate sensing and inspection, capture limitless data, and explore without boundaries. It mimics the movement of an animal, but also clearly looks like a machine. I know not to give this robot a cuddle. So then, how should I feel when I learn that its makers have called it Spot? It doesn't make it any more lifelike per se, does it? But it does intensify my appreciation of the distance between what it is and what it pretends to be. It reminds me that it is more police dog than pettable pooch. Combined with its agility, its grabbing arm, and its surveillance capability, this ironic naming is more likely to heighten my sense of unease than to reassure me. When we factor in that in the Odyssey, Homer also described driverless vehicles, self-steering ships that discern their course by their wits and of themselves understand the thoughts and minds of men, and that later representations of Jason's ship, the Argo, describe it as sentient, we may be tempted to conclude that the ancient world anticipated all our current preoccupations with automation. And yet, we now find ourselves confronted with the notion of bots that are not so much embodied androids as comprised of data. Our ancient ancestors could not have foreseen that the harnessing of electricity and digital technology would extend our development of artificial intelligence beyond humanoid automata to algorithmic entities. So, to finally address the question some of you may have been expecting me to answer, who is afraid of robots? All of us, at some point, and to some degree, it would seem. And yet, at the same time, they hold a fascination for us, a terrible wonder. One might be inclined to describe it as a love-hate relationship, but that implies feelings on both sides. And for now, at least, we have only a semblance of that. In practical terms, robots are slaves that don't make us feel guilty. They are friends that we don't have to treat well and that we don't quite trust. They are guardians that we own. They perform many of the functions of human interaction without the need for us to be humane. They are often ultra, super, or beyond human and monstrous, like this 18-meter tall moving Gundam that until very recently graced the skyline of Yokohama. But they are also mirrors that cause us to question our likeness and our unlikeness, especially when we make them in our own image. They demonstrate how technology can be a way of understanding the world, but also the need for caution when interpreting the past from a modern perspective. This head is one from a series of stone statues found on Sardinia and estimated to date from the 9th century BCE. These statues are greater than life size, and they're believed to depict warriors of some kind. It's tempting, isn't it, to see those hard features as indicating that their creators intended them to look robotic or at least mechanical. But if we're totally honest, we would have to admit that that might not be the case simply because this guy bears a striking resemblance to C-3PO. The history of automata and of thought about robots contains much that anticipates and helps us think about emerging technologies such as AI. Here too, we have human masters and robot slaves, and the fear of that relationship being disturbed or overturned. Artificially generated content raises questions of fakery and challenges our traditional notions of trust and authenticity, just as mechanical automata have for centuries. We may also be prompted to speculate whether certain uses of AI make us less comfortable than others because they fall into that uncanny valley. Might some of us be revolted by apps that seek to resurrect loved ones precisely because we experience them as digital versions of zombies? Specific to AI, however, is the risk that bots will take control of our minds as well as physical space, especially when humans embark on close relationships with them. And this may also cause us to reconsider the extent to which so many of us are already reliant on and augmented by digital technology. Are we hybrid beings simply because we make use of AI? The ancient Greeks may well have thought so. Last but not least, it would appear that we have always had a tendency to appoint gods of technology, to marvel at what they make, and to believe the hype and the mysticism surrounding their production. The current war of words between the technophobes and the technophiles has a very long and very rich heritage. Concerns over the risks of uncontrolled development of artificial intelligence are understandable and they are well-founded. But history shows that what we need right now is care, not catastrophizing. And above all, we will need data. Lots of data. But that, I am very pleased to say, is a story for next time. Thank you very much.